Hey guys. Welcome back to another long, quiet walk through the darker halls of history. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that doesn't begin with a battle or end with a coronation. It begins in silence, behind the thick curtains of royal chambers, with women born into golden prisons, and bound by blood to their own undoing. You may have heard stories about kings who went mad, but rarely do we hear about the daughters, the wives, the queens, whose bodies were used to preserve bloodlines, whose minds were crushed under the weight of family legacy, whose very DNA was a threat to themselves, and yet expected to smile, bow, and bear heirs. Tonight's journey is not about war, again and again, until the walls of a palace echo with ghosts that still have names. This is Bound by Blood. The tragic lives of inbred royal women. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and listen as the silence of history unfolds. Before she was called Mad, she was called Joanna of Castile, a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yes, that Isabella, the same queen who sent Columbus across the sea. Joanna was never meant to be queen. She had older siblings, stronger ones, and she wasn't political. She loved music. She loved books. She prayed quietly and wrote letters in the margins of her psalms. But when her siblings died, one after another, she became the heir. She was married off, as they all were, to a man called Philip the Handsome. He was charming, tall, blonde. She was obsessed with him, but the feeling wasn't mutual. He had lovers. Servants whispered about what he did at night in her palace. Joanna, pregnant and tired, cried behind closed doors. But no one heard her, because she was a queen, not a woman. She was property, and her husband was the one who mattered. She begged him to stay. She cut her hair in grief. Maybe not. She refused to bury him. She carried his coffin through the mountains of Castile. At night, she insisted no woman be allowed near him. Even in death, she feared he might betray her. And so they called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. They locked her in a convent, with her dead husband's shirt under her pillow. But was she truly insane? Or just broken by betrayal, by grief, and by the bloodline that made her royalty? She died alone. A queen who slept beside death. History remembers her only for her madness. Not the love that twisted her fate. Before we meet the queens who birthed monsters, let's meet one of the monsters himself. Charles II. Of Spain was born in 1661. He was the product of 16 generations of inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and eventually, nature began to collapse. Charles had what they called the Habsburg jaw, a jaw so massive he couldn't chew food. He drooled constantly. He couldn't speak clearly, and his tongue was so large that it sometimes blocked his throat when he slept. He had epilepsy. He couldn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was 8. His spine curved like they built portraits that hid his deformities. And they married him off to women who cried behind locked doors. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, was a beautiful French princess. She cried herself sick when she arrived in Spain. The court was cold, the food was foreign, and the king was a child in a man's broken body. She died at 26, possibly poisoned, possibly starved from grief. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen because her family had many children. He was sterile, broken, a living ghost of a dying bloodline. He died at 38, and with him, Spanish Habsburg dynasty crumbled. The cost of centuries of inbreeding was one man too royal to be human. Others were born twice royal, daughters of inbred bloodlines, destined to marry their own kin. But Maria Anna of Austria was both. She was the niece of King Philip IV of Spain. And in time, she became his second wife. Let that settle for a moment. She was raised to call him uncle. He raised her with gifts and letters and warm royal affection. And when her older sister Philip's first wife died suddenly, the royal court turned to Maria Anna. She was 14. He was 4. Their marriage was political, of course. Every Habsburg marriage was also genetically catastrophic. Their only surviving child was Charles II, the same broken boy we just met. And Maria Anna spent the rest of her life watching him suffer. Imagine the pain of a mother, knowing that her son's sickness was sown into his blood he inherited from her and her uncle husband both. She prayed often. She wore black. When her son's wives cried in frustration, Maria Anna comforted no one because she couldn't fix him. She was never meant to be a mother, not to him. She died long after her husband. But in truth, her story ended. The day Charles was born, a child who should have never existed, and a woman who carried the weight of two titles, niece and widow. She was called the most beautiful woman in Europe. But Elizabeth of Austria, Empress of Austria-Hungary, was also called the loneliest woman alive, born in 1837. Long after the Habsburg line had already rotted from the inside, Elizabeth, or Sisi as they called her, grew up wild and free. She loved riding horses. She hated royal rules. Her cousin laid eyes on her. He changed his engagement from her older sister. To her, she was only 15. He was 23, and her life of freedom ended that day. The palace gave her tutors. They weighed her meals. They examined her body. She was forbidden from raising her own children because the royal court believed a girl so young could never mother an heir. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, took her babies away. Sisi slipped into silence. She stopped eating. She wandered the palace gardens alone for hours, whispering to birds, writing poetry about death. She spent years away from court, in hiding, in travel, in sadness, and then, in 1898, as she walked through the streets of Geneva in disguise, a man approached her. He pulled out a sharpened file. He stabbed her through the heart. The wound was so small, she didn't realize she'd been mortally wounded. She walked for several steps, then collapsed. Elizabeth of Austria, beautiful, forgotten, and trapped in her role, died in a public square like a ghost no one recognized, and still, the world remembered only her face, not her suffering. She was born in Vienna, not for happiness, but to serve the empire. At 18, she was married by proxy to Pedro I of Brazil, a man she'd never met, in a land she'd never seen. She kissed a paper contract, and the moment the ink dried, she became Empress of Brazil. She traveled for months across the ocean, and when she arrived, she found a husband who was brutal. He was controlling. He had mistresses, dozens, with courtiers who whispered in Portuguese, a language she didn't understand. She gave birth to child after child. One died, another barely lived, and each time Pedro was absent. Her letters home were filled with one word, sadness. She died at just 29, exhausted from childbirth, her body used for alliance, her spirit forgotten by history, and in death she was buried under a title that had always been a lie, Empress. The year was 1833, and Spain was collapsing into itself, when King Ferdinand VII died. His daughter, a girl of just 3 years old, was declared Queen Isabella II of Spain. The court celebrated. But behind the velvet curtains, there was nothing but fear. A child on the throne meant opportunity for generals, for priests, for cousins and cousins of cousins, one claiming a right to her blood. Her mother ruled in her name as regent. But Isabella grew up surrounded by plots. It's poison in the rumors whispered in candlelight. A queen who bleeds early cannot be trusted. She was married at age 16, not to a foreign prince or a childhood friend, but to her double first cousin, Francis of Assisi. It was a marriage doomed from the moment they touched hands. Francis was distant, delicate, possibly homosexual. He wore lace gloves and perfume. Isabella despised him. They had children, but rumors swirled for decades that none of them were his. Isabella took lovers. So did her husband. They lived. And the ones who lived? They bore the genetic echoes of too many marriages between too few bloodlines. At 38, she was forced to abdicate, not because she was hated, but because her entire reign was built on a throne of sand. She died in exile, alone, her name scrubbed. Her daughters married off to distant kings, and Spain forgot that once a girl had ruled. A girl burdened with centuries of broken blood. Everyone knows her mother, Marie Antoinette, the queen with diamonds and cake. But few remember her daughter Marie-Therese Charlotte was born in 1778, wrapped in lace, raised on Versailles velvet, and watched every move her mother made. She was just 11 years old when the revolution came. She watched her father arrested, then her mother, then her brother, torn from her arms and locked away alone. And finally, she too was locked in the temple prison, child, alone, surrounded by silence and rats. For over a year, she was kept. In a dark cell, they gave her scraps of food. They let her rot in the same filth as her brother had. When they finally freed her, she emerged a ghost, pale, thin, and silent. She was the only member of her immediate family to survive, and though she later became a duchess, married off to her cousin in exile, Marie-Therese, never smiled again. She never spoke of her. Brother never mentioned her mother's execution. She rarely left her home. They say trauma lives in the blood. And for Marie-Therese, that blood ran royal, but it also ran haunted by the 20th century. The inbred bloodlines of Europe were unraveling. World wars made queens irrelevant. Republics rose where empires once ruled, and the marriages that had once sealed kingdoms now sealed nothing at all. But the legacy of those broken unions lives on. Portraits hang in forgotten palaces, faces twisted slightly, jaws too long, eyes too far apart. Medical records mention madness, seizures, deformities, all buried beneath titles like Empress, Infanta, Queen Consort, as if those names could hide the truth. Behind every royal crown worn by a woman was a bloodline that demanded loyalty, even to suffering. And many of those women paid in silence. They weren't allowed to scream. They weren't allowed to choose. They were told to smile, to marry, and to bleed quietly. Asterisk, tonight we remembered the forgotten not kings, not conquerors, but women, caught in a centuries-long experiment in power without mercy. If you're still awake or still listening, thank you for walking through this quiet, heavy chapter of history with me. This was Bound by Blood, the tragic lives of inbred royal women, written and told in calm memory of those who never got to tell their own story. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the darkest stories don't come from war. They come from family.